And then, of course, the 180 days. The 45 days and the 80 days, by the way, are cast in stone. There's no excuses, and I always use this as an example. There was a qualified intermediary in the state of Oregon who was doing 1031 transactions who stole the money.
Oh.
Actually, what happened was he got caught stealing money on one transaction, and the FBI went in and seized the accounts. Said no more money's coming out of these accounts until we figure out what's going on. They froze the accounts. Meanwhile, they had money of sellers that needed the money for the purchases, right? They couldn't get the money within the 180 days. So they go to the IRS and say, you gotta give us a break. And the qualified intermediary was corrupt. The federal government, you guys, froze the account, right? If you didn't freeze the account, my money's still there. I get it. The IRS said, not our problem.
Wow. Ouch.
Be careful who you give your money to, right? So when I say there's no excuses, that seems to me like a pretty good excuse, right? Not a valid excuse. The only time you can delay these things is when there's a federally declared emergency. It happens all the time, by the way. We've had like 4 in New York in the last 3 years. We had flooding 2 years ago. That was a nationally declared emergency. A couple of hurricanes came through. They were nationally declared emergencies. That's why that nationally declared emergency thing is very, very important, because it delays the timing on 1031. And they can give you up to a year additional time to, and that started with Katrina.
It just pauses.
What it does is pause it. It pauses it for 6 months to a year. So like when we're a qualified intermediary, we monitor these very carefully, and we go to all of our pending transactions and we contact the clients and say, listen, your time has been extended, right, so that they know, and they find it helpful. But these federally declared emergencies are posted constantly. I happen to get notifications every single time I know what happens in the country, because they do affect. And interestingly, if you have a federally declared emergency in New York State, where we're based, even if your transaction's in California, you qualify, because we're based in New York. So, but they do happen, and it doesn't, when they say federally declared disaster, it doesn't mean like everything was devastated. It could be just some really bad storm that causes it. So those are the only extensions. And then item D here was that you need to use a qualified intermediary. Unfortunately, you have to use a company like I have. That between you and me also is totally ridiculous. It should not be a requirement. They should just get rid of it. The law should be very straightforward. You sell a building, you have 45 days to identify to us, the government, you have 100 days to close. But unfortunately, you have to use the qualified intermediary. And the reason I bring this up, because this happens all the time, people go to a closing, then they speak to somebody and say, and this happens a lot, an attorney calls us and says, I have a problem because my client never told me he was doing a 1031, and I didn't set it up as a 1031. Can we fix it? The answer is no. Once the client gets those checks at the closing payable to his or her name, it's over. You can't do a 1031. It's got to be set up in advance, because the money has to go into a separate escrow account that the qualified individual holds. You don't really need to get into the minutia, but the point is, it's got to be set up prior to the closing.
How long
Can
does
it be
it
set up the day of the closing? 100%.
Okay. I was gonna say, how many days does it take?
Yeah, I mean, we're not happy if you call us Friday morning and say, I need all these documents in an hour, well, we do it. We do it all the time. But what you can't do is get the money, and then you call us and say, you know,
We're gonna do this.
yeah, you can't. This has to be set up. So anytime I have a conversation with a client about 1031, I tell them, you need to call me before the closing. Don't call me after the closing. I can't help you, and it still happens. They call me after the closing. I want to do a 1031. We had this conversation, right? People just don't listen. I can't even feel sorry for them. It's just their fault. So you need a qualified intermediary, and it's got to be set up prior to the closing. One interesting thing is, if I own a property and John Keane owns a property, well, let's say we own a property together. He owns 50%, I own 50%, and John gets tired of me. He goes, you know, Evan, you've been a nice guy your entire life, but you've turned into an asshole. I don't want to deal with you, right? Now, John has never said that to me, but could happen. In fact, it happens all the time, especially among brothers and sisters.
Correct.
Right? Brothers and sisters fight more than partners fight. So can John and I exchange properties in a 1031? Yeah. I can give him my half of the property, he gives me his half of the property, and that's a 1031 exchange. It's exactly like I'm talking about here, what we're talking about here is a preferred exchange where we sell the property and buy another one. That's a simultaneous swap, just two deed transfers. If you do a simultaneous swap like that, you don't even need a qualified intermediary. The attorneys take care of it. Now, I do speak to attorneys all the time that do those transactions. We put certain language in the deed that says that this is pursuant to a 1031, and they do it. But just so you know, that's a 1031 also that works.
So if it's not a swap, and let's say one of you is selling or transferring 50%, that person then has to do the same thing, the same process on 50%, right?
No, you don't have to do anything.
Oh, you don't have to do
You
anything?
don't have to identify. There's no 180 days because it's immediate. You don't need a qualified intermediary. It doesn't matter what you do with the money. It's simple. It's not very common,
Right.
but it happens. It happens more so than I think because I'm not involved. People swap all the time. But I do get calls all the time about swaps among partners, mostly siblings. You know, brother and sister own the properties, they own two properties. Their father left them.
No, but I'm saying if it's not a swap, if it's one person buying the other person.
Oh, then the person that's getting cash and keeping cash is gonna pay taxes.
On 50%.
50%. But the other
But
person.
can they do a 1031 based on that 50%? And buy something else on their own?
If they're getting cash in the transaction,
Right,
they can do a 1031 with that cash.
for the different, okay.
And that would be a deferred exchange, yes, they can do. They can combine a swap with a deferred exchange. That's something where you should definitely not be giving advice to people, right?
Now, what happens down the road when somebody, let's say somebody passes on, does their estate get a step up in basis? Or,
Yeah, so sometimes I get calls from people and they say, my mother died, I got this piece of property, I wanna do a 1031, and I go, when did your mother die? Sometimes they tell me 1940, right? This just happened with one Trillipan, and he died like 30 years ago. If they tell me they died last year or 2 or 3 years ago, they don't even need to do a 1031, they don't have a capital gain. Because if the property was worth $2 million now and the mother died a year ago, if it's worth $2 million today, it was worth $2 million then, right? There's no capital gain.
but let's say,
If they get a full step up in basis, the estate gets a full step up.
okay, so if the mother had bought properties, let's say the mother bought it 25, 30 years and did some 1031s then, and then when she passes away, her estate gets a step up.
Everything gets stepped up, the capital gain disappears to the kids.
Okay, good. I did that, exactly.
Yeah, capital gain. That's why when you call me up and say, is there any tax due? The first thing you see that I always do is like, who bought the property? They go, I bought the property. I go to Acris, they didn't buy the property. The mother bought the property. People just confused, they don't understand. But their confusion causes you to commit malpractice, and it's really your fault because you didn't do your homework. So we kind of need to know who bought the property, did somebody die in the interim? You know, a lady selling a house, did you buy this with your husband, did you buy this stuff? I bought it with my husband. Then I need to know, when did your husband die? Then I need to know what was the value of the house when your husband died, right? Because we need to know what basis on all this. So you get into all of these different issues, kind of have to ask.
Another question, does this apply to foreign properties or just in the States? Like if you live here and you got something that's coming to you from, let's say, Dominican Republic.
It's amazing how many times I get that question. Especially with the Dominican Republic. Maybe it's because I have a lot of Dominican clients.
What was the question?
So the question is, if you're selling a property in New York or the US, can you buy a property in the Dominican Republic?
I think it was sent to
was
reverse.
the-
Meaning, let's say, so my mother, I asked, this is happening, my mother is receiving some land from her father that passed, so she needs.
In DR.
In DR,
Yeah,
so.
no, that's not.
Yes.
You're not paying taxes.
So let me
You're
tell
paying
you, so I'll
taxes.
answer the question, because 1031 transactions are only for US properties and US territories. So the property that you sell has to be in the United States or US territory, and the property you buy can be in the US and the US territories. The Dominican Republic is not a US territory. Believe it or not, Puerto Rico is not a US territory. People are shocked to hear that. So can you sell in New York and buy in St. Croix? Yes. US Virgin Islands, US territories. Guam is a US territory.
What is Puerto Rico?
That's
Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth, it's got certain contractual ties to the US, but it is not a US territory. You cannot buy a 1031 property in Puerto Rico to replace the US.
Okay. Interesting.
You cannot do it. And if you sell a property in DR, you can't do a 1031, but in your particular case, as what John was just asking, Your mom inherited property from somebody,
Yeah.
right? When did that other person die?
I mean, she just told me about these moves and told me, hey, like, we should go to DR soon, so I just found.
So chances are that there's no capital gain on the sale of that property.
Right.
Because your mom got a step up in basis. If the property was worth 200,000 when the person died, it's as if she paid 200 for it. So if she sells it for close to the value when that person died, there is no capital gain. And by the way, it's reportable in the United States. If your mother's a U.S. taxpayer, a U.S. citizen, a green card holder, it's taxable. There would be no tax. But if your mom opens up a foreign bank account to put that money and bring it into the U.S., she's got to declare it. There's a whole other slew of issues that you need to deal with. That could be a problem. Yeah.
How long do you have to, also, let's say I live in this house, but I want to make it into a investment rental, how long do I have to rent it to make it into a rental?
So you have a property and it's not a rental or an investment property, but you're thinking about doing a 1031, so you want to convert it to a rental property. That sounds kind of sneaky, right? Can you do it 100%?
But what's the time frame?
So everything in 1031 uses the statute uses the operative word held. So 1031 transactions of properties that are held for trade or business or investment, there's a million interpretations. If you go online and you Google it, or you talk to people, they're going to tell you 1 year. I don't think that 1 year is enough. So I'll tell you what I think. Any time that you're doing something which is inconsistent with the prior use, like what you're talking about now, right? It could apply also, by the way, to a property that you want to move into, right? Does that qualify for 1031? No. But what if you buy it and rent it for some time and then you move into it? Can you do that? Yes. How much time do you have to hold it? It's the same issue. So anytime you do something that's inconsistent with what the old use was, what I say is you should straddle tax years. So what I mean by that is this. If the transaction is going to take place, the sale is going to take place in 2024, you should make sure that for all of 2023 it was a rental property. So you should have converted it in 2022. Because when they audit the 2023 tax return, both the IRS and New York State, they're going to look at the 2022 and they're going to look at the 2024 return. They always on an audit look at the prior year and the subsequent year. So if whatever you're doing, your scheme, your fishy story, right? Whatever you're doing in 2023, you want to make sure that 2022 is fully consistent with your story in 2023.
Next 2 years.
So that means you need to wait one full tax year in between whatever game you're playing. And by the way, it may not be a game, it could be legitimate. But you want to straddle the full tax year.
At least, yeah, to be sure that at least 2.
So that if the return is audited and they look at the year before, they look at the year after, it's consistent with your story.
Mm-hmm.
And these auditors, by the way, they're not like investigators. They're not like Perry Mason. They're not looking to get you. Trust me, they just want to get the file off the desk. Right? You think people think that auditors are like, oh, I got you. They don't want that. They want the file. They're overwhelmed, underpaid. They want the file off their desks. So if you give them a consistent story, they love it. They don't want to ask what happened the year before. They're not going to ask. You know, unless you're really unlucky and you wind up with a Greek auditor.
Might happen. Might happen.
Then they won't get you.